I know that you were adopted from Ethiopia, so can you go back and kind of tell us how that happened, how old you were?
Yeah, so I was adopted when I was 1 year old, but I didn't move back to the United States until I was 3. My mother was a missionary nurse in Ethiopia for 8 years, and then in Jordan for another 8 years prior to coming to Ethiopia. So her goal was to live there and raise me in Ethiopia, but then there was like a civil war that broke out, and we had to like leave in the middle of the night immediately when I was about 3. So that was when I came to upstate New York. That's where I was raised, and then we moved to Lancaster after I graduated from high school.
Do you remember any of that journey?
No,
getting out of Ethiopia?
But I love hearing stories, and so I was. My mother didn't anticipate having children, or didn't even think of adopting while she was there, and so that's just one of the things that I just love to hear my adoption story. I like to hear about my family because it's a really, I would almost say it's like an open adoption.
Okay.
Because she was a single mom, and so my father and my siblings are still in Ethiopia.
Okay.
And so it's just really neat. We stayed in contact with them and I still am in contact. We'd write letters, send pictures. I went back for the first time that I remember when I was 11. And then when I was like 23, we went back, and then we're hoping to go back.
That's great. So you have really strong connections.
Yes, absolutely. And we've always kept the Ethiopian culture alive in our household, having Ethiopian food, going to Ethiopian church services.
Okay.
My mother did speak the language, but I never learned our native language, which is Oromo.
Okay.
So that's always been part of my culture.
What can you tell us a little bit just about the adoption story and how your mom?
Yeah, so she was a nurse, and she lived in a rural. She was placed in like a rural community, which was Nedra. That's the village or the city where I'm from. And my birth mother, she got really sick and passed away. My father was a hunter. And so he came home, my mother had passed, and I had to go to a clinic, which was about 5 miles away. And I was the youngest of all of my siblings, and he wasn't quite sure, how to take care of a baby and what would that look like. And so he took me to the clinic thinking he was going to come back. But then he didn't have enough money, so he just ended up not coming back. But it wasn't to abandon. It was, he thought that there could be better hope, that somebody might be able to take care of me. Yeah. And so, my mother, she wasn't quite sure what to do with this new baby, She lived in a house that was close to the hospital, and so she would come and visit, and there was other people interested in adopting me, local women. But then my mother started asking around if she's allowed to, and that's how it kind of happened. And so immediately, one of the things is to have like a adoption in country, because that's essentially what it was. One of the family members, like the parents, had to be deceased, and the other had to get permission from my father. Okay. And so that's kind of how she had such an open relationship with him. It was immediate before she even thought. She went and talked to him, and he affirmed the adoption. And she did communicate that she would have liked to keep me in Ethiopia so we could be close to my siblings and him. But he completely understood when we had to leave in such a rush. But that was essentially how it was. And so the adoption was official when I was about 1.5. Okay. And then I stayed there until about 3.
Until 3. Does she remember, or does she tell you any stories about the night that you had to escape?
Absolutely. Like, it was all of a sudden like the militia came into that small village, and they were hurting people, not necessarily like killing people, but it was too dangerous for her to stay as an organization. Like that was like where they had deemed it unsafe. And so she had to leave, and we had to it was in the middle of the night, she said, and we went to the capital city, which is Addis Ababa. And there was no paved roads, and so the journey was rough, and you get dusty. But luckily, since we've been back, there's now paved roads, so it only takes about 8 hours instead of like 15 to 16 hours. Yeah, I know. And so it's just to think of, and the cars are not always like the best quality, and so it was just amazing how we got out of there so in a safe manner and into Addis Ababa.
So because you were so young, was there much of a culture shock going to New York?
What my mother says is that, you know, speaking two languages, you do have that somewhat culture where you don't speak English as quickly. And that's kind of what she had said, is that I grew up with our nannies speaking Oromo to me and my mom speaking English. My mom did learn Oromo and Amharic while she was there, since she was there for 8 years. But other than that, she said, I transitioned really well. I still went by my Ethiopian name, which is Tigist, and that's now my middle name. For up until about 10, she said, people like my family members would still call me that. Yeah, they still called me that, and it's really just a translation. So patience means Tigist in English, and then my mother's birth name, which is Opse, means Tigist. So we kind of all have the same. Yeah, so it's really, I think it's a neat way of getting a name. So yeah, I don't remember the too much transitioning when I was that young to the culture, but I just remember being welcomed by my American family with open arms. And
so how did you end up in Lancaster again?
so after I graduated high school, we've always lived really close to my grandparents, and they resettled from Lancaster in upstate New York about 50 years ago. And they had church planted and raised their children there. They had 12 kids. And then they wanted to retire, because that's where all of their siblings were. They retired in Lancaster County, moved into Landis Homes, and so we followed them. We've always been about 5 miles away from them, so it was just natural to progress to Lancaster. And that's where my mother was born. My mother was born in Strasbourg. So it was, she didn't really know if she was ever going to transition back to Lancaster, but it worked, and we felt really settled. So as soon as we moved here, I started at Hack.
Okay. And then after Hack, I know you have a degree in social work, correct?
So yeah, in Hack, I have my associates in human services, and then I transitioned into the bachelor's of social work at Millersville, and then I went on for an additional year to get my master's in
And now
social
you're
work.
an adjunct professor there,
Yes,
right?
yes. That was kind of neat, because I feel like you have to know somebody to be able to just get into the academic field, and without having your PhD, it's really hard, and that's nothing that I want to get into right now. That's a very time-consuming, but it's just not where my track is. But absolutely, yes, I've been with Millersville for about 4 years now. I absolutely love it, and it's in the social work department. It's in field seminars, so my students are completing their internships, undergraduate or graduate students, and so I say the best part of that is that I get to see them in their field placements. So wherever their internships are, I get to visit them and help guide them throughout that process.
So I know you're also really heavily involved in the refugee and immigrant community in Lancaster. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have always, like I said, been interested in different cultures and foods, languages, just the way somebody's culture influences them and how they just interact with other people. So when we had first moved to Lancaster, within a couple months, I would say, a Syrian family, wife was from Syria, husband was from Iraq, were resettled two blocks away from us. And we weren't part of any church welcoming them. It just so happened that my mother heard through the grapevine that they were from Syria. My mother had visited Syria, so that was really close to her heart. And so she went down and introduced herself, and so they've been like family. So we visited them weekly. They've moved since then, and we have too, but they've moved, but never more than like 2 miles away. So they call us our American family, and we feel the same way. But it's a husband and wife, and one thing that as a social worker, I always noticed that, I would go there to visit them, and I would always be asked to check their mail, just help guide them, which I'm totally fine with doing. But that was just something that, even though they had went past their resettlement process time, they still needed that extra support. But I also noticed that she also struggled with maintaining or getting employment outside of the home, just culturally, do I work more or less hours? What kind of work can I do? I don't really have the degree. I don't have the skill set. But I noticed she always would provide food. No matter what time of day you stopped by, how long you thought you were going to stay there, she'd always provide food, whether it be tea, biscuits, a full-blown meal. And so that was something that I took notice of, and I really love. She's an amazing cook. But one day I was thinking, you know, if I provided a space for you to showcase your food, or a space for people to eat your food, would you enjoy cooking on a regular basis? And she said, can we do it tomorrow? And I'm, again, a social worker. Yeah. And so I don't know anything about the getting into commercial cooking and the health inspections and everything. And I was like, well, I don't think we can start tomorrow. But so that's kind of what had encouraged me to start the cafe. And I've always been, just in my other jobs, I tend to be drawn to different cultures too. And I really was involved in like the Ethiopian community. There's one here. There's a few communities actually, but that is something that kind of, I saw a need that I was able to fill. And again, I don't cook. I don't enjoy cooking, but I enjoy networking, and I enjoy getting, supporting families where they're at. And so that was a simple thing that we could do. And like I said, it's a great partnership because, again, if I don't like to cook, she needs to cook, or the women need to cook. And so then I'm there providing that networking opportunity. But it won't work without each of us, you know? So it's a really equal partnership, which I think is really important when you're looking at equal pay, equal kind of just feeling like you're both working just as hard, but in different regards.
Okay, so that kind of planted the seed then for the Grape Leaf Café. And how many refugee women do you have that?
So last year was our first, like we started just as a pop-up because we didn't have a location, and we would just go to little events, pop-up events. We'd go to conferences, fairs, and I had 6 women cooking. I had a Syrian woman, Congolese, Sudanese, Pakistani, Nepali. Yeah, we had 6 women all together that cooked meals. And we also did pop-up buffets where we partnered with Awash Ethiopian Cuisine on Dillerville Road. And again, I had no restaurant experience, but I knew him, and I noticed, I was just eating there, and I noticed that they closed on Sundays. And so I just asked him, I was like, would you be willing to take a chance and let me use your kitchen and just try a buffet with my women? And he said yes. And so that's kind of how we started to showcase different cuisines, because our main cuisine is Syrian. She's the woman that's most regular that is available to cook. Okay. And so the other ones are just pop-up.
And have you seen any change in the women as they're getting to kind of showcase their food?
Yes. And so that's one of the things, like, again, a lot of so for when we do interviews or when we're doing events, I have my McCaskey servers or my students out there with me, because a lot of it is culture. They don't want to have their picture taken. They are behind the scenes. Okay. But for our first buffet, which was Syrian, we had 250 people show up. Wow. And our cook looked out the small little window, and her smile just lit up. And I said, look, they're here for you. They're not here for me. I can't cook. And so it was just amazing. So any opportunity that I have that she can showcase her food, she's really excited. And I even have had, just this past, I would say couple months, I've had 3 or 4 more women reach out and say, hey, can I cook for the cafe? And it's a stepping stone. So if the women ever want to open up their own restaurant, if they, because we want to roll out our little cafe to be a teaching kitchen. So we want to get them up to date with the food handling safety, safe serve kind of certifications that can progress them in the culinary fields that they want, or this is just a stepping stone to build a resume. You know, I'd be happy to write recommendations for them. So yes, we hope that breaks down isolation, because that's the number one thing that we see is, you know, you're either sitting in the home taking care of your kiddos, or you're just not quite sure how do you get out into the workforce when you don't have any experience. And especially for our women that do like to cook and would like to be in culinary in some or at another restaurant, you have to have that experience. And the only experience that they may have is cooking around their dinner tables in their homes. And that's great. And I always say, when you're cooking, I want you to cook like I'm sitting at your table. But most restaurants, they need you to have experience to have you start cooking. So I just want to offer that space to them.
That's great. And I was going to ask, that kind of leads me, I was just sort of wondering, because Lancaster does have a pretty large refugee and immigrant population, what are some of the other problems that you see that they might face?
A lot of it is, again, isolation, mental health is a big piece. Barriers to like transportation and employment are big. So when our families are resettled, if they're not resettled in an area that has consistent and reliable transportation, that eliminates a lot of things. I've also noticed that just the language is a huge barrier too. Kiddos learn the language quicker because they're in school, but then the parents are falling behind in that either they don't feel like they can learn another language, or they just lack that confidence. So many times our families that come to our empowerment center, they say, I don't speak English, but they know what I'm saying and I can get what they're saying. And so it's just that confidence. So I always encourage them to, if they can have a job like a Lowe's or somewhere where you're forced for people to come and talk to you, that's what they need. Because they, if we live in a community where we're hearing English or we're hearing the language, we're going to pick it up. But if we're not speaking it all the time, we may not have that confidence to say, oh, I know what you're saying. And they also, again, for the employment piece, is just having employers that are going to be sensitive to, they may need to ask you, what does this say or what does this mean? And let that be a teachable moment, not like, oh, I'm going to write you up, or let's put you in the back where our customers can't see you. So that's just something too, is just getting that confidence, building that confidence. Because that's what, like, especially with our Syrian cook, it was just that confidence. Like, she's an amazing person, an amazing cook, and she would be a great employer for anybody.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And the Empowerment Center, which we're in right now, can you tell me a little bit about what you do here? Yeah,
so again, the Empowerment Center uses my skills a little bit better than the kitchen as a social worker, but I noticed that with the cafe, we're meeting the niche, meeting the needs of women, but there was also other things such as mental health and case management and other services that, either I didn't notice while they were cooking or it just wasn't offered. And so with the Empowerment Center, we serve youth, men, women, children, and it's a safe gathering space, and it can support families beyond the 90 days. So I realized that we needed something, and through just hearing from other communities, they needed a center that they could call their own. And so this is the center that they can call their own. When we say that we offer groups, I don't want to create those groups. As a social worker, I can think of a ton of groups that maybe families would need, like parenting, budgeting, financial assistance kind of groups. But really, our families know themselves best. They know their communities best. There's already a lot of well-established communities here. And they can create their own groups. And then we have space for them to come in and meet. So that's where...
And it's a lot of different cultures that gather here.
And so we just started... Actually, the last month, I would say, we've had 2 African groups come in and just started meeting. They just need that space. And so then that's the number one thing that is you have to build that trust. Like, I can't just come out and say, hey, this is a great center. This is what we're going to offer. Community members have to say, hey, you can trust this person or you can trust this space. Because if you think about all the trauma that our families have endured, it's just not as easy as saying, just trust me. Yeah. They have to feel safe. Even if I tell them this is a safe space, they have to feel it for themselves.
Yeah. Are there any particular stories that hit you, different families that you've worked with or experienced?
Absolutely. So there's just one woman that recently came, I would say about 6 months ago, gave birth immediately. She came, she's from Cameroon, and she is one of the most resilient women I know. Because we just opened in January, and she came in for our grand opening when we opened here, and until about a month ago, she would come every single day that we were open and just sit here either using our computer, learning ESL classes, and utilizing the space as it's intended. She would bring her baby, and we now got her into a GED program. She is now staying with another host family. She's working towards getting asylum. And so that to me, and it's just amazing to see somebody using the space as it's intended. I'll be here. We have social workers on staff when we're open, but you don't have to utilize us. You know, if you just come here to have coffee, tea, listen to music, read books, I'm totally okay with that, because that's breaking down that barrier of isolation. Because before our center was open, she would just be home with a baby.
Yeah.
And so that's really, really important, is that isolation piece.
And you had said just personally that you had gone back to Ethiopia. Can you kind of talk about what that's like when you go back yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a really different experience, just because I feel so privileged to be here, and my family has not ever been out of our small village. Sometimes it's hard for me to go back because I feel like I can't do enough. And when I was little, my mom would always say, let's just bring them here, let's just bring them here. And she would always say they wouldn't want that. And going back as an older adult, I realized they wouldn't. It would be such a culture shock, so much that it wouldn't even be like the kind of things that they typically do. You couldn't do that. Definitely you can do that in Lancaster. There's farming, but there's not to the point where you can walk every place, and just the way that it's so fast paced here. So every time I've been back 3 times, I've been really trying to be part of my family and not just an outsider, because I feel like they want to treat me as like I'm this princess, or I can't learn to cook, I can't, carry chickens, walk goats. And so that's something that when we go back, I hope to go back in December, that I can just spend a week with my family, because they still live in huts. Like when you think of traditional, I was gonna ask, like, what is
life like for them?
Yeah, when you think of like traditional Africa, it's what it is. Like they're in dire poverty, and my siblings, and my nieces, I have about 14 nieces and nephews. And so I help pay for them to go to school, but they walk a really long way to get to school. And it's just like one of those things, it's a constant struggle. It's like, I don't think I can ever do enough, because when I feel like I've maybe patched a hole on this dilemma, another one comes up. So yeah, it's definitely traditional, African, what I envisioned, like living in huts, dirt roads, even though now to get into the city it's paved, but my father lives out in the countryside, and so when we would stay at a hotel. So I asked if I could stay with them, and they wouldn't let me, because they sleep on the floor, and they wouldn't let me stay with them. But it was like an hour walk to get to our hotel room, and he would do that every single morning before I woke up, and he would stay with me until it got dark. So yeah, it's eye-opening. And when I took my son the last time, at first I was thinking, like, the language, it's going to be such a language barrier for him. But let me tell you, he interacted with his nieces, with his cousins, like it was no other. They took him underneath his wing. Language isn't needed. The language isn't needed. They could still run and play, and they kind of knew what they were talking about. And I was just watching on the outside, and I just loved that. And he still talks about his cousins and wants to bring them over, and he'll understand when he's older, that they probably don't want that. But yeah, it's definitely there. So when that's kind of I use that when I'm thinking about our families now, like what barriers there are. We have language, we have the cultural aspect, but if we take away language, we have so much in common. And we just have to kind of break down that piece and understand. Just because you may not understand what I'm saying, you can take my hand and we can walk this way, and you'll see that we both need water. We both need to sit down and rest. We both need the same things in the day. And so that's a good reminder, is that sometimes when I am having the language conflict with my clients, I can just think, okay, what could I do that would maybe gesture something that is very similar, and we can get through this.
Yeah. That's great that they have someone kind of on their side that thinks that way. Is it kind of, when we were talking about what your family's life is like there, I have to imagine it's kind of mind-boggling for you to think that that's what your life
would have been. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I always say I probably wouldn't have survived. Just like That sounds horrible, but I just think of the things that, like, you know, for my sister, my one sister that lives closest to my father, so it's like my father's hut and then my sister's hut. They tend to live really close together, but my two older siblings, they moved to another village, so they don't live as close. But my one sister, she's a couple years older than me. She got sick and injured her foot, like somehow her bone broke and it didn't heal properly. And so when I visited last time, I noticed that when I was 11, I noticed her foot kind of looked a little different. And then when I went back about 10 years later, she couldn't walk on it. And I was like, oh, what could I do? What could I do? So I came back and I was able to contact with an orthopedic surgeon here who goes over to Cameroon to do surgeries, and I raised some funds to have her have the surgery there. But I just think of, like, you know, she didn't have any education. She was just kind of her lifestyle, and I just think of, you know, that could have been me. What would that have happened? You know, they all have very large families. I only have one child. So I just think of, like, all these things of how our lives are so different, but yet we're still connected